first of all, let me start by kind of getting into the punchline, if you like. And I'm not going to talk to you a lot about sustainability in the detail, because I'm sure you have many opportunities to learn about sustainability and what the environmental and social and scientific issues are around that. I want to focus on what the consequences are going to be and how it's going to unfold, and how this issue is going to change over time. And so I'm going to start with the idea that, is the opening line of my book, in fact, and I think sort of sums up where we are, and that is the earth is full. So the idea being that the earth is full is it's not just a rhetorical line, although it is, I think, a very good rhetorical line. It's a scientific line. It's a scientific argument that says that we're operating past our planet's capacity. And when we say we're operating past our capacity, that's a scientific measurement of the capacity of the earth to support this economy. And that's a really important framework, because when we think about sustainability, we tend to think about sustainability as a philosophical question. It would be nice if the world was more sustainable. And being unsustainable sounds like it's not very nice. It sounds like it's bad for the world, and it's bad for polar bears, and it's not good for forests. Whereas unsustainability, we kind of forget, is a very simple idea, and that is that if things aren't sustainable, they stop. Right? And if things can't keep on going, they stop. And we've kind of had this conversation for 50 years about if we don't change, the future is going to be not so good, or our children's children are going to suffer, or the like. And what we have to recognise is that the student over here misbehaving, I was about he's finished. Okay, sorry.
More important things.
That's right. Sorry, just kidding with my friend here. Is that seriously, when things aren't sustainable, they stop, means that what will stop, and this is shocking news for the world, is economic growth. Because what we're doing in our society at the moment is making the economy bigger and bigger, and assuming that we have this endless opportunity to keep on doing that. And the very essence of our economic system is based on a falsehood, which is the idea that we can have infinite growth on a finite planet. And this is, and I'm sure we'll have questions on this shortly, because this is a very dramatically strong assertion about where the world is going. Because many years ago we had this idea that economic growth was a way to solve all of our problems, right? This is how we would solve poverty, it's how we would create social stability, it's how we would drive new technologies, that growth would therefore be the solution to that. But I go back to the science and say to you, think about where we are today. So when I say the earth is full, you can look at a variety of different measurements of that, but one of the ones that I think is a good one is the Global Footprint Network, which talks about the fact that we need 1.5 Earth to sustain this economy. And that's sort of our baseline. And it doesn't matter, by the way, which scientific research you look at, it all concludes the same idea. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment says that we're using 16 out of 25 ecosystem services unsustainably. The Stockholm Resilience Centre's work on planetary boundaries says that we've already crossed several boundaries that we can't cross and have a sustainable economy. So we're kind of today behaving unsustainably. Let's think about what we all assume is going to happen next. We all assume, and every business is planning for, and every government is working towards, the idea that we're going to have 7.5% growth in China, if they can slow it down enough to 7.5%. And then when China's finished growing, India's going to grow, and then Africa's going to grow, and we'll all end up living like we do, in the West. So what that actually looks like, because it sounds like a nice idea. I mean, we'd all agree that there's no question that the people of China and India and Africa need to have more stuff, in particular food, housing, clothing, like some very basic stuff actually, is where many of them need to start. And that's obviously their right. That's obviously what they need, right? But what it means is we take this system operating at 1.5 times its capacity, operating past its capacity, depleting its capital, and we're going to make it 4 times that big by 2050. So just forget the economic theory, just think about the physical consequences of taking a system operating 1.5 times its capacity and making it 4 times as big, right? Think about China if they successfully lower the growth rate to 7% on average for the next 20 years, the Chinese economy in 20 years' time will be 4 times as big as today. So just imagine the resource constraint of that. Imagine their depleting aquifers, their need for food, their need for stuff, what that looks like, and today's situation where they're suffering enormously under the pressures of resource constraint and are very clear about that. They talk about resource constraint being an enormous impediment to growth and a threat to their economy, and imagine it being 4 times as big. So the point of that is just to say to you, despite the fact that everyone in the world's planning for it, despite the fact that we're all assuming it's going to happen, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because it's not physically possible, because when we talk about the consequences of that growth and operating past capacity, they're economic consequences. Right? They're consequences that will prevent the growth from occurring, and we can come back and discuss what that looks like in more detail. So why is it that when I write a book about this stuff that people refer to me as a very optimistic person when I'm talking to you about just how serious that consequence is? And the reason is that there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that we are going to face a crash. We are going to face a system-wide crisis which will make this current so-called financial crisis pale by comparison. That we are going to hit the wall. I think we are hitting the wall today. We are seeing the consequences of depleting water supplies, food supplies, resource supply. We're seeing that oil is becoming very expensive because it's harder to get. It's not we're running out of anything in particular. It's just becoming more expensive to get. And if you want to look at the economics of that, read the study by Jeremy Grantham, an investor from the US, manages GMO, a $100 billion investment company, who talks about the end of cheap resources, who talks about the fact that after 100 years of regularly lowering the cost of commodities and resources, they've now recovered all their gains of the last 100 years in the last decade, are back up where they started, and that's now the baseline we have during a recession, right? And recessions are supposed to drop commodity prices. We've seen commodity prices spike. So if we actually ever did get the whole global economy growing again, of course, they would go up even further, and then that would, of course, prevent the economy from growing again. So we're kind of trapped in this place. So what that means is I'm convinced that we are, and an increasingly number of people are convinced, that we are now facing the end of this economic system. That this idea that we're going to have quantitative growth in materials, that we're going to have growth built around the idea of more and more stuff, right? That we're going to keep on growing the economy endlessly, right? And then we'll be back to normal soon after this difficult time finishes, is actually wrong. And these are not difficult times, these are now normal times. And in actual fact, these normal times I think will become more difficult before they become better. So why optimistic? Because I think the evidence of history is that humanity is very good in a crisis. And I think we are going to face a very severe economic, social and ecological crisis. I think we're going to face the end of growth, as I said, but also a dramatic reduction, in the system's capacity. I think we are going to face a lot more conflict. I think we are going to face the potential, the theoretical potential for the collapse of civilization and a breakdown of society, and that when we're faced with such threats, when we're faced with such dramatic risks, we actually are very good in response, right? We have this very strange trait as a species, which I sort of sum up and say, when things are going well, we behave very badly. When things are going badly, we behave really well. And that applies at the personal level, at the company level, at the country level and the global level. We tend to respond really well when we're up against the wall, right? And that's where I think we're going, is that we're currently in denial about that, but that's the situation we're currently in. So then people say, so when does that begin? When does this crisis begin? And I say, we actually don't need the crisis to begin. We have to end our denial that we're in the crisis, that we're actually in it now, right? And it doesn't manifest in sort of ecological catastrophe, relatively speaking, yet compared to what's coming, but we actually are hitting that wall now. We're hitting those limits now. It's a reason that China, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia have been going around the world buying up resources, buying up land in particular to grow food. Right? There is a resource grab on now. right? And that resource grab is going to cause significant social and economic and geopolitical consequences to come. Now, we are seeing already, for example, the climate changing in very dramatic ways. I mean, imagine looking back on this time in 20 years' time or 10 years' time, and someone saying to you who is today, say, less than 10 years old, then is in their late teens, early 20s, and says, so just tell me how this works. So in 2012, when you'd had the hottest decade on record for the third decade in a row, right, when you had every scientific body in the world, every academy saying we have a serious problem, right, when we had spiking food prices, which we had in 2008 and starting to occur again now, when you've had spiking oil prices, which are again occurring again now, right? When we have, rioting in the streets of London, occupying Wall Street, like what we have here is a system clearly in the process of breaking down. So you imagine looking at that from the future and then asking the question, so what did you do when that was so obviously happening? And of course the answer is we don't see it that way, because we don't tend to look at systems in that way. We tend to look at systems in isolated pieces. But in actual fact, when you look at it as a whole, you see it's very clear that we're now in that crisis. So I think, it's not long now, basically. I think it's this decade that we start to panic. We start to recognise that this is actually a systemic problem, that the idea behind the modern global economy is fatally flawed, right? That we're going to have to reinvent a new form of economic activity and economic progress, that we're going to have to work out how to do that while developing countries develop. We're going to have to make space on this full earth to alleviate poverty. And not for moral reasons, although we can certainly argue it on moral grounds, but for self-interested stability reasons. That if we don't find a way to do that within the existing capacity, then we are going to face a world of greater instability, which will impact on the whole world. So we can't have a global economy where there are so many losers, right, in that situation. Now, at the moment, the deal is, think about, this is not how it's put, but it's how I'll put it. The deal currently is the poor let the rich get richer, right, on the grounds that the poor are getting less poor. So the whole kind of unspoken compact is, we'll let you get disgustingly, ridiculously rich if we can have a little bit of it. Now, if that stops happening, if we don't have room in the global economy for the rich to get richer, then the poor are not going to tolerate that level of inequity. Right, and therefore we have a very different sort of geopolitical, social conversation that has to happen to try and make room for that. The last sort of set of comments I want to make is really about how that, is it possible to have a sustainable economy, right? Or is this the end of civilization? Is this the end of capitalism? Is the market finished, right? And my answer is, it's actually, funnily enough, nowhere near as dramatic a change as it first appears. Because in a steady state economy, even if we had a zero growth economy in financial terms, and that's not the important issue is having a zero growth economy in material terms, but even if we had a steady state economy across the board, there is still markets that can operate in that context. There is still entrepreneurship needed. This is not a steady state of human progress. Right? It's a steady state in the idea of measuring everything through the growth of the money supply. So the issue for us is we need entrepreneurship, we need new ideas, we need innovation and change, we need new technology. We want what I call effective inequality. We currently have ineffective inequality. Inequality so extreme that there's no social stability in it. You want inequality to some extent because it taps into the human capacity for change and growth, right? You really do want, I think, reward for effort. You want people studying because if they study hard, work hard and achieve a result, they get a reward for it, but not the levels of extreme inequality that we have today, right? So where the US has gone quite mad, frankly, in terms of the levels of inequality, so it's become dysfunctional in society, right? So all the wealth is congregating in the top few percent, right? And the middle class is effectively disappearing in terms of their progress. That is not effective inequality. That is unfair and unsustainable. And perhaps most importantly, it's unstable, right? It can't be sustained as a system. So you have all those sort of ideas floating around. But we need effective inequality. We need markets, we need innovation, we need change because we wish to keep on progressing as a civilization, as a society with new ideas. But we don't need to have, right, a growing economy overall. There's no reason why companies can't compete, right, within a steady state economy to try and, to get market share and to change. So I think we're not changing that much. We're not changing the fundamentals of the idea. We're changing the parameters within which it operates. We're accepting that there are limits, right? Resource limits and other limits that we need to impose upon the market. I am personally a big fan of markets. I believe in markets as a mechanism for change. I believe in creativity and innovation. I believe in entrepreneurship. I just believe that markets have only ever worked within limits. And when people say to me, but government is bad, markets are always good, we should unleash market creativity to achieve those objectives, then I say, okay, well, let's take away all the limits. Let's really see if markets work. Let's start by taking away contract law. Because that's just the over-regulation of trust. I mean, people should be able to trust each other, so let's have no contract law. Let's have no IP law. Let's have no constraints on the market. Let's have no limits and see how we go. And of course, the reaction is one of horror. Oh, you have to have those limits. Oh, okay, so we agree we have to have limits for markets to work. So we're really just having a conversation about what limits we'd like to put in place. Right? And one of the limits we need to put in place today is on CO2, is on materials, is on inequality, because markets unleashed without any limits become corrupted and self-destruct. Well, that doesn't mean that markets are bad. It means markets only operate within limits that we need to now impose upon them. So this change that I see coming, and change coming driven by a crisis, is inevitable. Right? It has enormous potential for development and growth and potential for, a stronger, more stable civilization. It's going to be a bit messy, right, in transition. And I say that deliberately kind of making it sound not very bad, and it will be much worse than that. But it doesn't mean it's the end. It means that we get through a difficult period and out the other side, but with a stronger society, with a more stable society. And that's why doing stuff today towards this objective, right, is actually very important, because we're laying the groundwork, we're building the foundation on which we can build a different kind of approach, and that's where we need to go. So let me just stop that there and throw it open to, I'm sure there'll be questions and comments and feedback. Thank you. Yeah, you're in first. Go.
Me?
Yeah, you.
Hi, my name is Arvind and I'm in the MFM program, the financial program. And I read your book, by the way, and I think your ideas are very good and I'm on board with what you're saying. But essentially what you've said right now with putting limits on markets is going to kill globalization in a way, because right now the way in which we see globalization, big companies are using that as a price arbitrage to go into India, China, and have them manufacture for them. So in a world where you have so much technology right now that I can be connected to anyone in the world, how can the world live in those silos where you start creating those barriers that I'm pretty sure that the first thing that's going to come up is that nations are going to get directive about their own people.
Yeah.
And they're going to say no more imports, exports. Let's just try and see what resources we have, utilize them, and try and that kind of brings that communist kind of thing also back into play.
Yeah.
And democracy is again going to be affected by this. So given the fact that we have so many constraints, how do you think we're going to arrive at a solution?
Yeah. So I think that's a really lovely set of questions, really, is that I'll now give another half-hour talk in response, because that seriously, that is how this unfolds, right? Is that there is all those things are going to happen. But people say, but this resource constraint will drive nationalism and extremism. And I say, yep, it will. It will also drive greater democratisation, greater bottom-up, change in attitudes and beliefs. But globalisation, for example, is in the same category, that we are going to move away from such rapid globalisation defined as market efficiency. And I think we are going to move more towards globalisation in terms of values and ideas and beliefs. But I think there is the potential for both of those to happen. There is going to be more protectionism, I think. Right? I mean, that's where we're going to move towards that, partly for good reason, by the way. If you've fallen for the globalisation claptrap, that we've been fed, you would say, okay, well, I'm in an African country X, and the most competitive thing for me to do is to grow cocoa. so I'm going to disband my entire food production because the theory of comparative advantage is that I should produce cocoa and buy my food from elsewhere, which is really good for the global food companies who want that cocoa cheaply as possible. But for that country, if the cocoa market collapses, they starve. Right? So it's just not logical for them to do that. That's not building a resilient society. Now, should they produce a lot of cocoa because they can do it cheaply? Yeah, they should. But they should also produce food. Right? And they should recognise they need to plan for their country a sustainable, resilient society, which has economic opportunity, which creates wealth, but doesn't go so extreme that they undermine their own capacity. And that's where I think we have to get globalisation back in perspective. So I think the joy of the modern technology, internet-connected world is that globalisation has many, many benefits for us beyond producing stuff cheaply. Right? So the way ideas can move around the world, the way people in China can believe that they can achieve things, right, based on ideas elsewhere. You know, the whole sort of Thomas Friedman, the world is flat kind of idea means that we can actually trade ideas and knowledge, and you can be in India and do this in America at the same time. Like all those many, many, many good things about that, right? But there are also bad things, and so I think we're going to have to balance that. I do think we're going to have to impose limits, but let's not confuse limits with an anti-democratic, anti-market idea, right? That I do think it's important to remember that World War II, right, where there was strong limits put in place, massive intervention in the economy, direction on the economy, right, and in the end, successful war was waged by democracies, right, against non-democracies. There is something quite robust about democracy. I mean, China is just incredibly confusing to me on lots of issues, but, you know, it's not like a dictatorship, right, nor is it like a democracy. It's kind of democracy if you're invited into the 80 million members of the party, right, but it's still a democracy. I mean, they're fighting at the moment, right, about direction and people being removed, and, you know, it's sort of it's a different process than we're used to, but I'm not sure that it's any worse than the American democratic process, you know, when there's a lot less than 80 million people involved in the process. So I think I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying it's different. And we have to kind of open our minds to the idea that maybe it's not the form of decision making, but it's what people demand is what changes. Right? So in Libya, it was clearly not a democracy, right? And if anybody thinks that power can hold on to itself in the face of people not supporting it, then, you know, the people will eventually plunder the castle and remove you, and that's what happens, right? So I think all I'm saying on that issue is that don't be simple in the analysis. Think about a much more complex world of democracy or not, of decision making or not, remembering that democracies can make strong decisions when they choose to do so, and strong limits doesn't mean anti-markets. That's a kind of 60s idea that it's markets or limits. We actually know now that markets only work when they have limits put around them. So that was a long answer. That's a big question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Elsa from the MBA program. Going back to markets efficiency and steady state economy that you were talking about, I think that's a very interesting idea. However, my concern would be, if we have a steady state economy, wouldn't that be a risk of consolidation leading to oligopoly?
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, you basically have a concentration of power within a few companies. And would you think that's what we're heading to?
Mm-hmm.
If that's desirable, and if not, how would you counter that?
Yeah. So I'm not convinced, and I don't know. But I have thought about it a lot. I don't think that a steady state economy inherently encourages that. I think capitalism encourages that. So every capitalist wants to be a monopolist, right? It is the nature of capitalism to take more and more control, to get more and more. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That is the nature of the system. Therefore, the limits have to be imposed upon that. So the same problem applies in a growth economy as it does in a steady state economy. And the only answer can be regulation. You know, control. I mean, a more vibrant democracy, say more competition, will discourage it anyway, right? So making sure that the rules of the game don't encourage that to occur. But ultimately, it's a question of intervention, as we have had in every country with antitrust laws, right, and anti-monopoly powers, is to make sure that doesn't happen. And I'm not sure it happens any worse in a steady state economy. I think in many ways the competition could be stronger in a steady state economy because you have to operate within those limits, and therefore market share becomes the driver of progress, right? Because the end of growth to me does not mean the end of growth of companies, right? It's the end of growth of the material use of the society, which I think will mean the end of growth of the financial size of the society as well for quite some time, if not forever. But that's not the point. The point is that material is the issue.
Would the answer be to actually incentivize entrepreneurship instead?
So, yes. So I think that applies. My point is yes, but that applies regardless. So I think we need to incentivise entrepreneurship today. I think we really need to encourage people to grow new businesses a lot more. That social entrepreneurship and economic entrepreneurship are essential for a vibrant economy, regardless of the other conditions. And so putting in place both cultures but also incentives to encourage that, I think, is a healthy thing. And just don't expect big business to support that, because it's not in their interest to support that. Right? I mean, self-interest is a very, very powerful driver of change, right? And they will always, resist small companies growing because it's not in their interest for that to happen. So therefore, the system has to put in place support to counter that weight.
But government budgets are stretched actually. Who would actually pitch in to fill that gap, since the big corporations are not going to do it because it's not in their interest?
Well, there's this thing we used to have called taxes, which were sort of used for doing good things to the world, right? And we have this kind of weird idea now that taxes are bad, right? That lowering taxes is always good, right? And for a start, we should question that. And obviously, taxes, I'm not saying all taxes are always good and we should maximise all taxes. What I'm saying is there are vehicles in place to do that. There are mechanisms we have in society to achieve certain ends. Now, you can't argue whether it's more or less as good or bad in any given situation. That's a debate we have to have. But there are incentives you can put in place without costing you money. So, CO2 limits, for example. It doesn't need to cost money for the government to limit CO2, right? So you would encourage entrepreneurship by increasing the price of CO2, right? So as soon as you do that, you encourage innovation and change. And innovation and change preferentially encourages entrepreneurship than big corporates. Because big corporates, I spent 15 years working with, and I've advised DuPont and Ford and just a whole bunch of big global companies on this issue. Right? And I know that they are slow to change. So change actually encourages entrepreneurship. Change, creates opportunities for people to do things differently. So just creating change actually is one of the ways you can make a more dynamic economy in that sense, which doesn't cost anything. Like the James Hansen model for climate scientists from the US, model for carbon pricing, he said put it at $100 a tonne, put it at $200 a tonne, but do all the money right directly back to individuals. Right, so basically tax the entire economy at $100 a tonne of CO2 and send a cheque every month to every person, right? And then you'll soon get the incentives in place, and people won't resist. People don't trust government to deliver that money. This is the sort of US sort of centric view of the world, maybe less just US these days. But his point being that would actually be a very popular way of doing it, because if you think I don't like this tax, but boy, I like this cheque every month I get. Right, then you start to restructure the economy in that way. So we don't have to think about government intervention and limits as being about spending taxpayers' dollars. There are many ways you can incentivise things by rules and let the market do what the market does very well, which is to respond to limits, to respond to opportunities, but we've got to put those limits in place. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Anasius Nenos. I'm still a bachelor student, third year. And I'd like to ask you something about what you would think our role as students would be. Because I've seen that from what I saw, for instance, I saw your talk in TED Talks, and you also talk about the same topic. And then you give an overall view of how growth and how overall economies and governments and markets should work. But you don't really give an advice in the sense of what people as individuals should do. And I really like when you said, for instance, that we should focus more on social entrepreneurship, but I just wanted to know your own twist about it, and also what your plan is, because I know that right now you're doing sort of a tour with your book, and what are you trying to achieve with that? Like, where are you going?
Yep. Yeah, good, thank you. So I think, first of all, what to do is do something. So and I say that sort of flippantly but seriously, is that action is a very powerful thing. Is that what we tend to do is spend too much time thinking about what is the right thing to do and not enough time just doing things. And the reason that's so important is because we don't know what the right answer is to drive the change more quickly. That's why so many people try so many different things, right? And therefore just doing things is very powerful. What you can say though, for sure, is that the giant organisations and companies that will be influential and powerful in 10 or 15 years' time don't exist today, almost all of them. Because that's when you have rapid change, it occurs anyway. You know, Google, we all have the examples of companies that have been created and grown into monsters very quickly, and how rapidly that can change, and how big companies can fall and new companies can be created. But we kind of forget, therefore, that what we're doing today is the seed of that. So therefore, doing things today, entrepreneurship, new ideas, is very important. It's always important, but if I'm right about the scale of change and the scale of the crisis and the need to build a completely new economy, then that becomes twice as important. So doing things today is important, because I don't think most old organisations, and I mean in that NGOs as well as companies, most old organisations won't adapt to a rapidly changing world. Most of them will cease to exist and be replaced. Right? That applies to many countries, it applies to many companies, and it also applies to many NGOs. So I think the having confidence to sort of, in a more compressed answer, say, create organisations, create companies, create new ideas, and recognise that failure is a good thing.
So you would say that instead of trying to work with the ones that we have, like the businesses we have to create new models in that sense.
That's my view. So I do a lot of work with existing companies, right? Because I think some of them will make it. And it's important in the meantime that they are advocates and supporters of change. But I actually think most of them won't make it. And therefore creating new institutions is actually really important. Not least of all because this is not just a technology question. It's a way of thinking question. Now I think the Occupy movement is a really, forget what they're standing for, but just as a way of organising the movement. I think what they stand for is wonderful, by the way. I think they're terrific. But it's crazy. If you said, I'm going to go, I know the organisation, I've been on their email list for a decade. And so, every year or so they say, we're going to start a revolution, right? It's just going to start on this date in this town. I go, here we go again, yeah, sure. Right? And they keep on doing this kind of stuff, crazy stuff, right? With no leaders, right? No plan. No solutions, and just say we're going to start a revolution. And then suddenly one day it worked, right? And that has fundamentally changed, not that they will, run the world, they don't want to, but they're saying inequality is an issue, right? When I say the 1% in America, everyone knows what I'm talking about. The 99, so we changed the language around equality just like that. That was a bunch of, hard-edged, on the edge of the fringe of society people, right, who just had an idea. And that idea has changed the world. It hasn't fixed the world, but nothing's going to fix the world with one idea. But that idea has changed the world. And they're going into these big protests. They have no leaders. They just make every decision by committee. They're self-appointed. It's like any old institution would say that will never work. I suspect no old organisation could have delivered that. Only a new organisation could do that because they're confident enough to try radically new ways of doing things because they feel as though the old way has failed them. And that is, I think, is a very important lesson of trying. Most of those things don't work, but some of them do. So it's like a Google in the kind of, social change area. Yeah.
And what about your view? What are you trying to do? Because I could see that you were involved in many of these organizations. I also saw you were part of, I believe, Greenpeace. So you've been doing quite a lot, but now what are the next steps?
Yeah, I don't know. Got any ideas? Seriously, my chosen path now at the moment, recognising that I've been the head of Greenpeace worldwide. I've run 2 companies. I've taught at Cambridge University. I've tried lots of things, but it's kind of all the same thing, which is that I'm helping to drive social change towards a more sustainable world. Now, the form in which I do that is not important. The essence of the idea is what drives me. at the moment, travelling around talking to people, and I sort of deliberately divide that between the kind of CEOs, heads of large companies, and what I think is the new economy, grassroots, that's going to create the new economy. Right? So I don't bother with the middle. I sort of will talk to the heads of the existing system, which can be security, defence departments, corporations, whatever, and then I talk to Occupy type groups, student type groups like this, because I believe that we have to build a very different economy, and that will come from the ground up. So that's my focus until that doesn't work anymore. Yeah.
So I haven't read your book, I must be honest.
Well, come on, we'll wait. It's all right.
Sorry. I will download it on my Kindle tonight. But I did, on the Kindle, you can quickly
Yes.
flash through it. So you spoke about, I think it was the happiness society and life after shopping. Because what you're talking here is a big scale. You're talking about governments, you're talking about things up there. But us ordinary people here sitting in the room, right? And when I go to Africa and I go to China and they want food and they want water and they want clothes and they want a TV and you come along and you say, you are not allowed to shoot that rhinoceros because he's an endangered species. They look at you like you're crazy because they say, you know what, that corn is not only going to feed my family, it's going to feed my extended family as well. So get stuffed with your, you know, great ideas. How are you going to teach us not to want to shop?
Yeah.
How are you going to teach us that happiness has nothing to do with wealth?
Yeah.
Because this is, you've got to start here.
Sure,
not there.
Sure. And it's going to be harder than stopping people
Exactly.
killing rhinoceros as well. So this is the idea that there is actually a post-consumer society. Because, you know, think about it, you know, in the last 20 or 30 years in every Western country, we have approximately doubled the personal wealth of per capita, right? So we have, and everything's got cheaper. So we've got more than twice as much stuff as we used to have, much more, right? And we all know that maybe some of the students don't, but you end up with this life full of stuff, right? Now, what's interesting is that in that time that we've doubled the size of the Western economies, right, had dramatic improvements and increases in the amount of stuff that we buy, there has been not a single movement in average life satisfaction. Not a single movement. So in every Western country. So everything that we've done, all the work that we've done, all the extra hours that we've worked, the climate that we've destroyed, the forests we've cut down, has done nothing for us. Which says to you, we have a system problem. Because we're about to double it again. And then we'll be having more stuff and less forest and and no that. So the point being,
I want to debate that with you.
Okay.
Because, you know, you've got all these research which shows, for instance, Vancouver is the happiest city in the world. The Netherlands, which even I was very surprised at because arranged here, we were very happy people.
Yeah.
And why are we happy? Because we have security, we have stuff, we have a stable government.
Yeah, no.
All the
But
stuff
unpack those things. So secure government, yes. Safety, yes. Stuff, no. Right. So what happens is that people, and this is we could debate the research forever, but and I'm happy to send lots of it to you. Now you'll be getting a lot of emails on this. Is that the evidence is very clear that once you get past a certain level of physical satisfaction, those things don't matter anymore. What matters is safety and security and stability, right? Freedom to operate, information, community, right? Strength of relationships. They're the things that make our lives in a higher quality. And so if you're in a country in poverty, there is no doubt at all that more stuff makes you happy. But once you get to a certain level, more of it doesn't help. So therefore, an economy built on that idea is fundamentally broken. Therefore, the whole, you know, I sort of say, only half jokingly, you know, there is life after shopping, because we can't imagine that world. Right? It's very hard to imagine because we're bombarded all day with information that says the only reason you're not happy is because you bought the wrong model of this or that, and if you buy the next one, it'll be a different colour, it'll be faster. It's like the iPhone advertising campaign, iPhone 4, this changes everything. No, it doesn't. It's just a new phone. Right? It just doesn't change everything. It's just ridiculous. The whole idea, but that whole language is that you'll be sexier, happier, smarter, more popular, more loved, if only you bought the right one. And if it doesn't work, then you buy the next one, that one will work, right? And none of it works, right? So that means the essence of the idea is broken. And therefore we have to move beyond that. Then the question which you actually asked, how will we learn to do that? Because we'll have no choice. right? Not because we'll have, I do think there is a very strong social movement about buying less stuff. There's a great campaign in Australia now spreading to the Netherlands and the US called Buy Nothing New Month, right? So it's saying don't give it up completely, that's too much, but just try not to buy anything new except for food and medicine for a month. It's sort of like a consumerism detox program. And so what happens is people do it, it's like incomprehensibly difficult for the first few weeks, and then you suddenly find I have more time, right? I have more money. My life actually hasn't changed that much and my credit card bill's a lot lower than it used to be, right? And then I think, okay, maybe I can take some of this into my future life as well. So that idea, I think, is very powerful. That's the bottom-up movement, but what will basically happen is we'll be forced to, because the economy won't survive in its current form, and then we'll adapt.
Can I just ask one more question? So sorry,
Yeah?
because this is quite interesting. So we'll be
It's
forced
obviously a very personal issue, the shopping thing.
probably. So we'll be forced to,
Yeah.
you're saying, but there's no equality. It's not where we all forced to. I want more than you. I have more power. I'm China, and you are a little country next to China. I will
Yeah.
just take over, and you
Yeah.
will have nothing, and I will have more.
So that, as I said before about the question about democracy, it's going to be messy. It's going to be messy, right? And there's going to be nationalism, there's going to be resource grabs, there's going to be conflict between nations, and hello, that's what we have today, right? The rich today have more than the poor. The rich today take more than their share, and we argue about that. That won't change. So the thing is, what will change though is the context in which that happens, and the idea that this sort of compact where we agree that the whole system will grow, therefore the poor will be better, that will be broken. Because if the system's not growing, that becomes a very different conversation.
Yes. You mentioned Thomas Friedman before. It made me think of him talking about you when he spoke of it's no longer deal with the current problems, but brace for impact. I'm curious to know two things from your perspective. One is, what is that impact going to look like? And as an optimist, what comes after that?
Yeah, right. Okay. So, I mean, the impact, I don't think is going to be ecological, right? So we kind of think about the system breaking down because it's environmentally and resource driven. It will be about environment and resources. That will be the cause of it, but we'll see it as an economic impact. So I think we are going to face either kind of this constant bouncing where we are now, right, where we can't grow the economy because if we do, resource prices spike and stop us growing, and we can't go when we're sort of drowning in debt. So if we don't grow the economy, we can't pay off the debt. If we do grow the economy, resource prices go up and we can't grow the economy. So I think we're kind of stuck in this place, in which caught between growth and debt, if you like. But I think more likely it's just going to crash. I think we're going to have a sort of system-wide instability and impact, which will actually drive the economy down a lot. Right? So I think that's what the impact looks like. And then it's like hitting your head against a wall. Right? There's this big wall up here that says resource constraint, right? And inequality and a whole bunch of social unsustainabilities. And we're currently hitting our head against that wall, right? And it hurts, right? We call this great financial crisis. I'm asked, so this is not a crisis really. Let's get some perspective on life. But let's call it a crisis. That's a crisis. We're hitting our head against the wall and it hurts and we're bouncing off. And then we're going to hit it again and we're going to bounce off. And eventually we'll realise the wall isn't going away and we should go this way instead. Right? But that's going to take a while because we're in denial about climate change. So we're going to be in a lot more denial about the fact that the whole global economic system is broken. Right? But I do think once we accept that crisis, which I think I'm talking a decade, I'm not talking 30 or 40 years, I think this decade it becomes really clear where we're going. Then the crisis response is one of extraordinary opportunity. Remembering that, this is not, even though we have this major problem emerging, we have 30 to 40% growth rates in renewables. Right? We have more money being invested in renewable power than we do in fossil power most years recently. Right? The price of renewable energy is dropping 20% every time the capacity doubles, which is every 2.5 years. Right? So there is this idea where we're going to dramatically, right, change this economy anyway, and therefore what I'm saying is that that's going to happen much faster than we're expecting. So it's not like we've got to start from the beginning. We know everything we need to do. We don't need any new technology. And we're going to have new technology, which will make it easier, but we don't need it. So I think that scale of change will be dramatic and exciting. Not smooth, right? And it means the end of a whole bunch of companies and industries, but it also means an incredible opportunity for change. And just to quickly end on one little economic number on that. So think about this. So all the world's governments and all the world's major corporations agree that 2 degrees of global warming is a maximum we can tolerate in terms of the system stability. 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. What that means to have an 80% chance of achieving that, 80% chance of achieving that, as I said before, you need to not burn 80% of existing reserves. So, as we were saying before, just think that through in terms of economic impact. Now, we're taking out an enormous amount of value from the economy. Therefore, the economy is going to crash in that sense. However, as that money is withdrawn from those industries, it has to go somewhere. And as it goes somewhere, that industry grows. So even though I sort of see difficult times coming, I also see enormous opportunities coming, because the only way through that is to go and rebuild this new industry. And therefore that change is going to be very positive as well as being very kind of scary in process. How are we going for time?
Yeah, about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, yeah.
What would you recommend to RSM as a business school in order to prepare students and maybe even the society for that?
Yeah. So I think, I spent 15 years doing running my own strategy consulting business, working with CEOs of large global companies. So I think a lot about business strategy and what works and what doesn't work in the market and in corporations. If I was to say one single thing, it would be that making purpose central to business strategy is critical. So that shareholder value is like if saying a company exists to create shareholder value, it's like saying I exist to pay the rent on my apartment. Right? I mean, you have to pay the rent on where you're living or you've got nowhere to live. So it's essential, but it's not a reason for being. You do that so you have somewhere to live. It's like the purpose of shareholder value is to measure progress, right, and to explain the performance of an institution. It's not a reason for existing. What's the reason for existing is having a social purpose, which is helping society be a better place. Right? And the reason that's so important is because that it's kind of like a magic where everything else flows behind. Right? That if you are making the world a better place, the stakeholder society in which you exist wants you to succeed. Right? The government wants you to progress. The government doesn't see itself as controlling you, so that if I keep you under control, so while you're making money you don't do too many bad things. If you're doing good things, the government says, we want you to be successful. How can we help you be successful? In terms of attracting employees, if you're doing something really important for the world, people want to work for you. So putting that idea of purpose and passion central in business, I think, is critical. Therefore, for a business school, right, teaching that idea and measuring and showing the progress of why that is a powerful idea, but also giving students purpose, giving students a belief that, making the world a better. I don't mean making the world a better place as in doing what I do. It could be making the best coffee ever produced. Right? It could, which is a really noble purpose, by the way. It can be art, it can be music, it can be great products, it can be taking lighting like what it says, Waka Waka, which you'll hear about at some point, I'm sure, because he's going to be famous for doing it. Taking lighting to developing countries, right? So people can study at night time. There's lots of opportunities out there that are just physical, industrial things that need to get done, which are making the world a better place, right? And that, I think, is a very powerful idea in business. Yeah?
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank
Good.
you for being with us.
Thank you.